So in preparation for next week's question and answer session, I've been reaching out to all the people I know in the medical community. And I talked to my cousin Ro, and she said that I should be smiling more in these videos. So here you go if you're watching, Ro. But today is actually a down or double whammy. So we are going over the Tuskegee studies and how racism is still being implemented in even genetic studies. So in light of that, I decided to come back to the dog beach and yeah, hopefully maybe that will make it not so sad. Maybe you will smile, but yeah, bummer of a topic today. Today we're going to be going over Alan Brand's article, Racism in Research, the case of the Tuskegee syphilis study. So first, here's a quick survey of what the study was. In 1932, the U.S. Public Health Services, USPHS, started an experiment in Macon County, Alabama to determine the natural course of untreated latent syphilis in black males. The test comprised of 400 syphilitic men as well as 200 uninfected men who were serving as controls. The first reports of the study was published in 1936, with subsequent papers issued every 4 to 6 years through the 1960s. By the early 1950s, penicillin had become widely accepted as a treatment for syphilis, but the men did not receive this therapy. Instead, actually, on several occasions, the U.S. Public Health Services actually interfered and prevented the men from getting any treatment. Moreover, in 1969, a committee at the CDC decided that the study should be continued. So in 1969, they still decided that the study should be continued. It wasn't until 1972, when the national press picked up the story, that the Department of Health and Education and Welfare, H.E.W, stopped the experiment. At that time, 74 of the subjects were still alive, and they know that at least 28 of them had died directly of advanced syphilitic lesions, and perhaps as many as 100. So again, 400 of them entered the study, and they are pretty sure that 1/4 of them died directly of the disease that they were just watching them die of. So in 1972, the U.S. Department of H.E.W, so USD H.E.W, appointed an investigatory panel which issued a report which found that the study had been unethically justified, and it argued that penicillin should have been provided to the men when it became widely accepted as the course of treatment in 1950. Okay, so to have an idea of what's going on in this study, it helps to have an understanding of the racist ideologies going on in the early 1900s. So in the US in the early 1900s, Darwin's theory of evolution was seen as the basis for American racism. Black people were seen as less evolved and could not assimilate into civilized society. They were described as particularly prone to disease, vice, crime, and more so than any other race. And they could not be helped by education or even philanthropy. Some social Darwinists predicted that the race was doomed to fail and become extinct in America because American blacks were thought to be going through a degeneratively evolutionary process. So these racist views started in anthropology, ethnology, and biology, and eventually made their way into medicine. So here's a little bit of evidence of that. This is a quote from Dr. W.T. English. A careful inspection reveals the body of the Negro, a mass of minor defects and imperfections from the crown of the head to the soles of the feet. Cranial structures, wide nasal apertures, recessing chin, projecting jaw, all types of Negroes as the lowest species in Darwin's hierarchy. So part of this racism had to do with blacks supposed excessive sexual desires. Doctors also reported a lack of morality amongst blacks. So these two ideas led to the notion that black men were a danger to innocent white women. So W.T. English goes on to say that the perversion from which most races are exempt prompts the Negro's inclination towards white women, whereas other races incline towards females of their own. And then also goes on to say that gray matter of the Negro brain to be at least 1,000 years behind that of the white race. His genital organs were overdeveloped. According to these physicians, lust and immorality, unstable families, and reversion to barbaric tendencies made blacks especially prone to venereal diseases, which is what syphilis is. They believed that black men had been disease-free when they were slaves, but now that they're freedmen, they are spreading the diseases. Moreover, these physicians believed that treating these patients was just simply not possible, since blacks did not trust the medical communities and would not seek treatment. So in light of this, Thomas Murrell says, "So the scourge swept among them. Those that were treated were only half cured in an effort to assimilate to complex civilization, driving their diseased minds until the result were criminal records. Perhaps here, in conjunction with tuberculosis, will be the end of the Negro problem. Disease will accomplish what man cannot." So before the actual Tuskegee study got started, in 1929, with a grant from the Julius Rosenwald Fund, the USPHS conducted a study in rural South to determine the prevalence of syphilis among the black community and explore the possibility for mass treatment. So they surveyed 6 counties, and Macon County was the one that was found to have the highest rates of syphilis. This is where the Tuskegee University and the Tuskegee Hospital was. So this study found that mass treatment was possible, but unfortunately the funds dried up as the economy crashed at the beginning of the Great Depression. The ironic thing is that the Tuskegee study, which led to many people never being treated, was based on a study that demonstrated that mass treatment would be effective. So Dr. Talinsforo Clark was in charge of the Rosenwald study, and he noted that the study merited further attention. Since the people who had the illness were already known, we could gain knowledge by observing them. So they reached out to the Tuskegee Hospital, one of the few historically black hospitals and black-run hospitals, and convinced them of the value of the research. So in one of the letters, Dr. Clark said, "The results from these studies of case records suggest the desirability of making a further study of the effects of untreated syphilis on the human economy among people now living and engaged in their daily pursuits." So apparently this study was also inspired by a Norwegian study, which saw the withholding of treatment from syphilitic patients from 1890 to 1910. The point of that study was to demonstrate that current treatments were ineffective. The big difference of this study and the Tuskegee study was that in the Oslo study, they stopped the study as soon as arsenic therapy became widely accepted as a treatment. So arsenic therapy was considered dangerous and toxic. Nonetheless, the Oslo study clearly demonstrated that the treatment markedly reduced the progression of the disease, the chances of relapse, and premature death. So in light of these differences, mainly once the treatment was proven available and widely available, the one study was stopped and the other one wasn't. So in light of that, it seems like, we really can't use this Oslo study to justify the Tuskegee study. So instead, what really seems like that is justifying the Tuskegee study is the prevailing medical attitudes at the times towards black, sex, and disease. To be clear, Dr. J.E. Moore, he was one of the advocates about treating latent syphilis, and he said that the Oslo study was a never-to-be-repeated human experiment, but he thought that the existing knowledge did not apply to Negroes, and so Moore went on to serve as an expert consultant on the Tuskegee study. So even someone who knew and thought that the Oslo study was really bad thought that the Tuskegee study was justifiable. He went on to was a consultant on the study and approved of it. And so it's then the only difference there was one was people in Norway and they were all white, and the other one was people in southern Alabama and they were all black. And so it's yeah, the only thing that really seems to be justifying this study is just the racist ideologies going on in the background. So yeah, one of the really terrible parts about all of this is that the Tuskegee study made that last part, that the patients would be less likely to seek treatment. That last part, a self-fulfilling prophecy, because now of studies like this, black people are actually less likely to trust the medical community, and justifiably so. So they had a lot of difficulty getting started and finding test subjects. The study called for men 25 to 60, so a lot of people thought that these were disguised draft physicals. On top of that, the rates of syphilis were not as high as they were expecting. So it was actually around 20%, where they were expecting 35%. They also had difficulty getting people to sign up because there was no treatment available. They started packaging it as a continuation of the 1929 study, and they were also promising the participants treatment, deceitfully right off the bat. In reality, they were never told that they were part of a new study. They were never told that they were only given placebos, and they were not even told that they had syphilis. Instead, they were just told that they had bad blood, which was like a euphemism for syphilis. The men were so eager for medical care that the people who ended up defaulting out of the study ended up becoming insignificant, which explicitly undermines one of the justifications for the studies, that black people would not want to seek or continue treatment. So this study almost failed, and it only got started and continued because of lies to the patients and convincing them that they were getting treatment. It was only supposed to last for 6 months, but then in the summer of 1933, the USPHS decided to continue the study. The idea was that it seemed only natural to pursue the research since the sample already existed, and given the down economy, the cost of treatment was considerably prohibitive. But what's actually really disappointing here is that there's no indication that treatment was ever considered. After they collected the relevant information from the patients, as Dr. Wenger puts it, as I see it, we have no further interest in these patients until they die, at which point they would need to be autopsied to confirm the findings of the study. The researchers used more lies and deceptions to entice the men to getting the autopsies. To make the research even more robust, they recruited 200 non-infected men to become the control group. But when some of the subjects in the control group became infected, they were simply transferred to the experimental group, which is a clear violation of almost, just the scientific method. It's just a violation of research protocol. So then they also hired a black nurse to continue the follow-up care and to give these families, to get the families to agree to the autopsies. To gain their trust, she was giving them non-effective treatments. This was the spring water or an aspirin. She also gave them transportation to the hospital and hot meals when they visited. So it seems like deceit was an integral part of the study, and still it was difficult to convince the patients to come to the hospital when they were severely ill, and it was still even difficult to get them to agree to the autopsy. So in 1935, to further incentivize these patients, the USPHS promised to cover their burial costs. The first paper of this study was published in 1936, and it found that syphilis in this period, latency, tends to greatly increase frequency of manifestation of cardiovascular disease. So only 16% of the subjects gave no sign of morbidity, as opposed to 61% of the control group. So a study 10 years later also coldly noted the fact that nearly twice as large a proportion of the syphilitic individuals as the control group has died is a striking one. The life expectancy at this point had been reduced by about 20%. And then in a 1955 article, it found that slightly more than 30% of the test group autopsied had died directly from advanced syphilitic lesions, from either cardiovascular or central nervous system. And another published account states reviews of these still living reveal that an appreciable number of late complications of syphilis will probably result from, at least in contribute materially to, the material cause of death. And then in 1950, Dr. Wenger had concluded, we now know, where we could only surmise before, that we have contributed to their ailment and shortened their lives. So as a black physician, Vernal Carve, a member of the later H.E.W. panel, wrote, they proved a point, then proved a point, then proved a point. On several occasions over the 40 years, the USPHS had sought to ensure that the subjects not receive treatment from other sources. So in 1934, the researchers met with local black doctors and asked them not to treat the men. They also distributed letters with the names of the men to Macon County physicians, requesting them to refer the black men to the USPHS if they sought care. When the Alabama Department of Health sent in a mobile VD unit to Tuskegee in the early 1940s, the USPHS asked the test subjects not be treated. And then also when the Army drafted several of the subjects in 1941, and they began them on anti-syphilitic treatment, until the USPHS gave the draft board a list of 256 names to be excluded from treatment, and the draft board complied. Sorry, there's a dog that's like yelping over there. I don't know if you guys can hear it. It's totally fine. It's just like on the leash wanting to go. So yeah. By the 1950s, penicillin was considered to be an effective treatment for syphilis, but the subjects were not given it anyway. By 1952, an estimated 30% of the subjects had received treatment, but only about 7% of them had received enough to be an effective dose. So I guess luckily for the researchers, the study had not been spoiled. But I think unluckily for the participants, because if it had been spoiled then they probably would have stopped the study then, and they would have given it to, well, I don't know if they would have given them the treatment, but they would have stopped deceiving them at least. Man, this is a messed up study. So in the 1960s, the USPHS reevaluated the study, and so here's a couple of the excerpts from the minutes. Racial issue was briefly mentioned, will not affect the study. Any questions can be handled by saying these people were at the point that therapy could no longer help them. They are getting better medical treatment than they would under any other circumstance. So in 1969, a group from the CDC met to determine whether the study should also be continued. So some physicians advocated that it be stopped, but there was a consensus that it be continued. Dr. J. Lawton Smith remarked, "You will never get another study like this. Take advantage of it." A memo prepared by Dr. James B. Lucas, the Assistant Chief of Venereal Disease Branch, I guess at the CDC, stated, "Nothing learned will prevent, find, or cure a single case of infectious syphilis or bring us closer to our basic mission of controlling venereal disease in the United States." He concluded, however, that the study should be continued along its present lines. The study was not stopped until the experiment was picked up by the national press in July of 1972, at which point data was still being collected and men were still being autopsied. In August 1972, the U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare formed an ad hoc panel to respond to these criticisms. This panel had 9 members, 5 of whom were black. Primarily, the panel focused on 2 questions. First, was the study justified in 1932, and had the men given their informed consent? Second, should penicillin have been provided when it became widely available in the 1950s? Secondarily, the panel would determine whether the study should be terminated, and it would assess current policies on human experimentations. So some think that focusing on these issues just misunderstands the study's purpose and initial design. First, the panel concluded that the major ethical breach was in not treating the patients when penicillin became available. But this disregards the fact that the medical community had an effective treatment for syphilis in 1932. Moreover, this ignores the fact that the study was predicated on non-treatment. And, even worse, that the USPHS prevented the men from ever receiving treatment. Second, the report concluded that the experiment was ethically unjustified because they failed to get the informed consent of the subjects. But this is a clear understatement of what actually happened. So, this statement from the final report that submitting voluntarily was not informed consent indicates that the panel believed that the men had volunteered for this experiment. But in fact, the subjects had been misled, deceived, and lied to about their illness and the treatment. Finally, a failure to place the study in proper historic context obscures the essential racist nature of the experiment. The final report from the panel was considered the Tuskegee study to be a one-off, a well-intentioned but misguided study. The panel was concerned with how this might affect the perception of other human experimentations. So the report claims that a better designed experiment could have been justified. Sorry, there you go, Ro, there's your smile. They say it's possible that a scientific study in 1932 of untreated syphilis, properly conceived of, with a clear protocol and conducted with suitable subjects who fully understood the implications of their involvement, might not have been justified in the pre-penicillin era. This is especially true when one considers the uncertain nature of the results of treatment of latent syphilis and the highly toxic nature of the therapeutic agents then available. But this statement is just completely contrary to the proven untreatment of syphilis in 1932. They explicitly knew that not treating them was way worse than the very toxic arsenic therapy way back in 1932. So to say that the study was only unjustified because of the 1950s availability of penicillin is just completely missing the point. In the Southern Medical Journal, Dr. H.E.W. clearly articulates some of the defenses of the Tuskegee study. The argument centers around the idea that we had limited knowledge of effective therapies for latent syphilis, and even by the 1950s, penicillin would not have been an effective treatment for the men in the study, even though that is incorrect. Others argue that men were spared from having to undergo the highly toxic arsenic therapy, even though that therapy was proven in 1932 to be better than untreated syphilis. These contemporary defenses of this study sound like they are relying on the underlying racist assumption that justified the experiment in the first place, that these black men would never have been treated anyway. Dr. Charles Burnett of Stanford University wrote in 1974, "The lack of treatment was not contrived by the USPHS, but was an established fact which they proposed to take advantage." Dr. R.J. Heller said, "I don't see why they should be shocked or horrified. There was no racial side to this. It just happened to be in a black community. I feel this was perfectly straightforward study, perfectly ethical with controls. Part of our mission as physician is to find out what happens to individuals with disease and without disease." But all of this is missing what really is important in the ethical issues of the Tuskegee study. As Brand concludes, the Tuskegee study reveals the persistence of beliefs within the medical profession about the nature of black, sex, and disease. Beliefs that had tragic repercussions long after the alleged scientific basis were known to be incorrect. On top of that, the health of the entire community was jeopardized by leaving a communicable disease untreated. There is little doubt that these researchers regarded these subjects as less than human. This is the Kantian point about treating others as mere means to an end, denigrating their value of life and merely using them as a means to scientific knowledge. This is wrong regardless of the race, but in this particular instance, it is wrong because the subjects were chosen for their race, and it's because they were seen as lesser because of their race. So this also brings up questions about how the medical profession self-regulates. The USPHS regularly sent physicians to Tuskegee to check on the progress of the study and to collect data. They were publishing these findings every 4 to 6 years, and there were many points along the way where the medical community could have stepped in and stopped, but they allowed it to continue. No one seriously considered the mortality rates or even just the usefulness of continuing the study in the first place. And it wasn't stopped until 40 years later because of outside pressures from the national press. So in hindsight, the Tuskegee study probably shows us more about the harmfulness of racism than it did about the harmfulness of syphilis. It shows us that our biases can harmfully influence our scientific inquiry more than the nature of the disease that we're intending to study. Yeah, that's a pretty crazy idea. The degree of deception and damages in the Tuskegee study have been seriously understated. As this article by Brand suggests, the notion that science is a value-free discipline must be rejected. We need to be more aware about which ways our social values and attitudes are seeping into and affecting our professional behavior. So the idea here, it can be summed up in the idea that we can't get rid of our biases. The best thing we can do is be aware of our biases. And I think that's what Brand's trying to say here. These biases had a negative, harmful effect, and we can't, think about science as, being bias-free because we are the humans doing the experiments. We are the ones who have these biases, and it's going to affect this research. So the idea is not to ignore these biases, because if we do, then they're going to seep in anyway. The idea is to be aware of them and to try and mitigate them at all costs. So as I said, today we're going to go with a doubleheader. Now we're going to talk about Michael Yurdel's, Dorothy Roberts, Robert DeSalle, and Sarah Tishkoff's article, Taking Race Out of Human Genetics. So since the Human Genome Project, genetic pioneers and social scientists have been calling for an end of using race in genetic research. However, this has not happened, and race is still being used as a biological category. So to be clear, the concept of race we're going to be using for this paper, it has historically been used as a taxonomic categorization based on common heredity traits such as skin color to elucidate the relationship between our ancestry and our genes. We believe that the use of biological concept of race in human genetic research, so disputed and mired in confusion, is problematic at best and harmful at worst. It is time for biologists to find a better way. So here's a brief history of the concept of race. W.E.B. Du Bois was one of the first people who went through the scientific research and concluded that race was not a scientifically significant category. He argued that health inequalities are caused by social, not biological differences. So, on the other hand, Theodosius Dazhensky, one of the evolutionary geneticists in the 1930s who helped explain race in light of evolutionary theory, he was, one proponent of that, but he kept ignoring the main problem, which is, how do you actually draw these lines between these populations? How do you differentiate them? He eventually became disillusioned and went on to say that scientific study of human diversity has floundered in confusion and misunderstanding. So I'm not quite sure about this story. It seems pretty anecdotal, but, I guess maybe there's more to the story. It apparently resonates with people in their field. So he goes on to say, the problem that now faces science of man is how to devise better methods for further observations that will give us more meaningful results. So since race is not a useful concept, Dobzhansky challenges the scientific community to find a better way to study and observe people. So modern medicine has very different opinions about how useful race as a biological concept is. So on one hand, some argue that relevantly important genetic information can be sussed out by using racial categorizations. Others argue that race is just the best proxy we have for doing this research on human genetics. On the other hand, it has been shown that using racial concepts is neither relevant nor an accurate way to study and explain human experimentation of genetic diversity. On top of that, others have pointed out that using race to make inferences about a patient in clinical settings is questionable, especially with the growing number of biracial individuals. So these authors are not the first to bring up this issue, and they're probably not going to be the last. Others have definitely brought up this issue before. There have been proposed shifts to focus on racism as a social relation rather than race as a presupposed innate biological predisposition in the interpretations of racial and ethnic effects. There is a failure of scientists to distinguish between self-identified racial categories and assigned or assumed racial categories, and a concern over the haphazard use of reporting of racial and ethnic variables in genetic research, and the need to justify use of racial categories relevant to the research questions asked and methods used. So some scientific academic journals have responded to these last concerns and have issued guidelines on how to use race in the research that they're going to publish. In spite of these efforts, though, there really has been no major changes about the use of race in academic research. Specifically, part of the problem now is using race as a tool to make sense of big data. So to be clear, race is distinct from ancestry. So ancestry is about one person and how they're genetically related to everyone else. This is a very detailed information about individuals' genealogical information. In contrast, race is a concept which is associated with individuals with a preconceived geographic group or social group, and it often implies a hierarchical organization of these groups. So today there is no clear division between racist and non-racist beliefs. Today's research can dryly be described as an experimentation of population-level differences between groups with the goal of understanding human evolutionary history, characterizing the frequency of traits within and between populations, and using an individual's self-identified ancestry to identify genetic risk factors of disease and to help determine the best course of medical treatment. So this means that they are looking for how often certain traits appear in members of a racial group, and then if it's significant, they're going to make note of it, and then they're going to use that information to make inferences about patients' care based on their race. So you might be thinking, okay, if this helps a patient get better care, then what's the problem? Well, the problem is that the results from this research don't support that race is an a priori classification, which suggests that race is not an inherent way of classifying people or grouping them together. And so this tells us that it's not going to be a good guide as we once thought it was. Further, when researchers try to use genetic information to delineate these races, they find that their genetic information is heterogeneous and offers no clear boundaries between the different racial groups. As a result, some diseases are misdiagnosed or underdiagnosed because they are associated with certain races or geographical regions. Another problem is that the use of race in genetic research implicitly reinforces these racist beliefs, even if the scientific research is not explicitly about race. And finally, this problem is not going to go away with widespread available genetic testing. Currently, this is impractical, but it's unrealistic to think that we can simply rely on an individual's genetic information to be able to give them the best medicine. But still, this is just even missing the point altogether that race is just not relevant to genetics. So there's a little paradox here between believing that race is an insightful tool for studying human genetic diversity, and believing that race has these really poorly defined markers and imprecise proxy for the individual's ancestry and genetic information. So it's been more than 5 decades since Dobzhansky challenged the scientific community to come up with new methods for studying human genetic diversity. So in response, these authors propose that first, academic journals and professional societies should encourage the use of terms like ancestry or population to describe the groupings in the studies, and require that the authors make it clear how such variables are being used. So it is better if we focus on genetic ancestry, culture, societal, socioeconomic status, or language, or any other variable instead of race to do the scientific research. So I think the point is that to get better data, to get better results, we need to be more specific about what we're studying. We need to be more specific about how we group these people together. And considering these, we need to go beyond. If we're going to do that, then we're going to just go beyond an individual's race. Some think that this is not going to make a difference if there's still, this underlying racial ideology, racist ideology. But language does matter, specifically scientific language. It has an outsized influence on how the public perceive genetic research. And yeah, so they're not the first people to call for these changes, but the changes that have happened have been minor and independent and sometimes inconsistent. And so this is making the change more confusing, and it's making it more challenging to make a lasting change here. What they're asking for is essentially the rationalization of the use of race in each study. They think that this is going to force the researchers to be clearer about the groups that they're studying. But on top of it, it's going to have this further implication that it's going to make it easier to compare the results of that study to other studies if they're clearer about the classification systems that they're using. So the goal is to phase out the racial terminology in the biological sciences. Is a clear way to send a message to the racist ideology of superiority and inferiority has no place in the medical sciences. Okay, so I'm going to add a little caveat here. Just because race is not insightful in the biological sciences does not mean that race is not useful in political or social sciences, specifically to study racism and its biological effects. All of these studies have the same problems, like the inability to clearly define race, but these studies are still very important for our understanding and rectification of institutional discrimination. So further, the authors propose that professional institutions convene panels or hold conferences on how biological sciences can move past the use of race as a classification tool in research of human biology. This point is pretty simple. We, need to do better, have a better scientific way to study genetic diversity. The committee would look at how the concept of race has historically been used, but it would also look at how current and future technologies can be used to meet Dobzhansky's challenge to propose a better way for us to study human populations and derive reliable results. So regardless of what you think about race and research, this is really just a challenge to be thinking more carefully and seriously about ways of getting better, reliable scientific information about human genetic information. All right, so yeah, this is kind of related to the research that I do in my dissertation. I research the metaphysics of organized social groups. And so organized social groups are one kind of group of people. These are groups of people with some sort of structural organization. And so to make an argument about them, I have to separate them from other kinds of groupings of people. And so I look at how other groupings of people are done, and it seems like it's, these classification systems. And when you really start to look under the hood of all these classification systems, you start to think okay, well, which ones are justified? Which one's a good classification system and which one's not? So for example, a haphazard or gerrymandered grouping of people might be, all the people who have blue eyes and their, left foot is larger than their right foot, based on these biological, markers and things like that. But it's that's not a useful way of, classifying people. And so the same thing is kind of being said here. It's race is not going to be a useful way of classifying people, and so it's not a good way for us to be using that. So yeah, this is an interesting topic, and it's something I hope you seriously consider, and yeah, I look forward to talking with you guys about it in class.